Hello. In this tutorial, I will be covering primary and secondary sources. So let's go ahead and get into the differences between primary source materials and secondary sources. Primary sources can cover a wide range. They can be architectural or artistic artifacts that give insight into the culture or belief systems of early civilizations. They can be a work of art or a photograph immortalizing a moment in history. The numerous amounts of diaries and autobiographies we have are all primary sources. Poetry, literature, and other creative works will also be considered primary sources. Now, primary sources are not limited to the past. They are continually being created and disseminated. State of the Union speeches and other public addresses are primary sources. Historical letters, or in the digital age, emails, and the numerous social media outlets are also primary sources. Newspapers and news websites are primary sources that are created daily. They are a great primary source as they give us so much information about the societies that produce them. Original research gives us insight into the research and experimentation done in all fields of scientific study. Government reports and data sets such as the census report or COVID tracking websites give a ridiculous amount of information about our country and its economic, racial, and demographic setup. Now, secondary sources, on the other hand, are basically our responses to primary sources. Secondary sources can take many forms from newspapers to textbooks. So any second-hand reporting on a news event will be a secondary source. Scholarly journals not publishing original research are considered secondary sources. Biographies, unlike autobiographies, are written by an author that did not take part in the events, thus they are secondary sources. Movie, literature, theater, and music critiques and analysis are secondary sources as they were written about an original production. Just remember, if it's about a primary source, it will most likely be a secondary source. Of course, there are exceptions to these rules. So here are some of the examples of how a secondary source can also be a primary source. For instance, if you're writing a paper on a news industry and how they reported during a particular time period, you would be able to use the newspapers as a primary source. The same would apply for textbooks if you were writing about the history of education. Now, movie, TV, and other critiques can also be primary sources if you're writing about the popular perception of a particular work. So here are a couple examples to further highlight the differences between primary and secondary sources. In the first example, we have two books on Martin Luther King Jr. One is written by him, and the other is by a historian. Because King wrote about his experience, his book is a primary source. The other was written about King by an author who did not experience those events himself, making this a secondary source. In my next example, let's imagine that you have an assignment to interview someone and write a paper about it. Now, regardless of how you recorded the interview, be it an audio or video recording or a written transcript, this is a primary source. The resulting paper that you write about the interview is a secondary source. This concludes the tutorial. Thanks for watching.